And a very warm welcome to you all this evening. Krissy is still managing her own event, even though she's on long service leave. Anyway, thank you, Krissy. Good evening, everybody. A very warm welcome to you all this evening on a very wet night. Thank you for braving the storm. Krissy maintains that her grandmother sent the storm, but we've persevered. We have not let Lottie win. So yay, thank you to you all. I'm delighted that you're all here to celebrate the launch of another book by the wonderful Krissy Kneen. Can't wait for you all to get into the 3 burials of Lotty Kneen. So just some housekeeping. Now's a chance to turn your phone to silent, but do feel free to engage in as much social media as you like. We're at Avid Reader 4101 if you're tweeting, and Krissy, of course, is all over the socials. In the nicest possible way, I mean that. So the toilets are behind the counter and up the stairs and right to the very end. We'll be doing a signing after. I think the bar will still be open after as well. Now I'd like to begin the formal proceedings by acknowledging the traditional owners, the Yagara and Turrbal, and paying all of our respects to elders past, present and emerging. This is a land that people have farmed, grown wheat on, grown crops, told stories, and we hope to continue in that very long tradition. It's always been a place where babies are welcome, and a very special welcome to the youngest avid reader. So this is Charles Theodore Jamison, who is 3 days old. So congratulations, Fiona and Trent and Essie. We love building our customer base one baby at a time. I think I've done all the housekeeping. Yep. Have I done all the housekeeping, Krissy? Yep, I've done that. Okay, great. Like I said, I'm just so honoured to be doing this. Krissy's a very dear friend. She's been integral to the success of Avid Reader, and we couldn't do what we do without our Krissy. But my job now is to introduce Mandy Brett, who is the senior editor at Text Publishing Company in Melbourne, and she's the editor of 3 Burials of Lotty Kneen. Please welcome Mandy Brett.
Thank you, Fiona. I won't take up much of your time. Thank you, Brisbane, for your warm welcome. Thank you, Lottie. Yes, I'd like to say I'm here specifically for the launch, but in fact, it's because my colleagues decided they needed to get me out of the house. We're still working from home for some reason. I have been working with Krissy for, how long is it, Krissy?
Oh, 10 years.
It's longer than that. Because it took us more than a year to do affection.
So
11 years, yeah, probably. And had we, that partnership, which is, I can't remember how many books strong now, was 7. Well, I'd expect you to remember it. You've got nothing else on. Yes, that started with the memoir Affection. And had we launched the 3 Burials of Lotty Kneen last year when we were supposed to, apart from the fact that Lottie staged a global pandemic to thwart that, it would have been a full circle of memoir at a neat 10 years, but I don't think that's really Krissy's way. I don't think her career's come full circle. I think it's going to continue snaking on and doing its very wonderful and idiosyncratic thing. And I'm very happy to be here to help Krissy launch the 3 Burials. And just to let everybody know how very proud we are of Krissy at Text and how much we appreciate the work she does in literature and the work she does. She works so hard on her own writing, and she also works very hard for her community. And I know that how appreciated that is. And so it's a time when we're just appreciating good people, and Krissy really is one of the good ones. So congratulations.
Thank you. Thanks.
Now, I'm delighted to introduce Bj Silcox. Oh, sorry, I don't have my glasses on. Bj Silcox, who will be doing the official launch and a wonderful conversation. And Bj is an Australian writer and critic whose literary criticism and cultural commentary regularly appears in national and international arts publications. She really should be a bookseller because she's already sold a really great book to me, and I read a big chunk of it last night, so thank you, Bj. So if you also need other book recommendations, go and see Bj. And she also happens to be a character in Krissy's latest book. Please welcome Bj Silcox.
Hello. Is that working for everyone?
Closer.
A little bit closer. How's that? Okay, everybody, lean in. Do I have a story for you? It's Cairo and it's 2018. I've just moved to the city and it's Ramadan and it's summer and the heat is desiccating and the streets are deserted even though there are 23 million people in the city because it's Ramadan and you can't eat until sunset, so you sleep during the day. And then at night, it's feasting and neon, and the Nile is alive with party boats and music. And in my hotel room, which is above a function centre, the fireworks bang against the windows and wake us up at 2 and 3 and 4 o'clock in the morning. It is a strange world because I was in Tasmania 2 weeks ago, and now I'm in the desert and there are fireworks, and it's an odd feeling. And I've packed a suitcase full of books that I've never read before. So when I get homesick, I will break the seal on the suitcase and I will pull out one Australian novel at a time. I've been there a month. It's an autocratic, twitchy government. The streets are full of 18-year-old men with guns. I'm still getting used to them and what they say about me that I'm beginning to understand. And so I pull out completely randomly this book because it has jellyfish on the cover. And in the nighttime with the neon party boats, I feel like I'm underwater. I've never read this strange woman before, but I start reading at 1 o'clock in the morning and I finish at 4 o'clock in the morning. And it's discomforting and erotic and strange and brilliant. And I've never felt this way before. So I write a fan letter, the first fan letter I have ever felt the need to write. And I write to Krissy Kneen in Australia, I think, saying, "Dear Ms. Kneen, this was meant to be my cure for homesickness, and instead you have done something else to me. You have taken me underwater. You have made me learn how to breathe again. If you're ever in Cairo, come visit." It's a whimsical, hopeful invitation. I think nothing will come of it. Within the week, Krissy Kneen has decided to visit because that's what Krissy Kneen does. My email, my one and only fan letter, has winged its way across the world to rural Slovenia, where Krissy happens to be, where she is investigating the story of her beloved grandmother, who found herself on a strange journey from a rural village on the border of Italy, in Slovenia, to Alexandria. And she writes to me and she says, "My grandmother grew up in Alexandria. My mother was born in Egypt. I was going to go, but I didn't know anyone and I was too afraid to go. Do you think it would be safe?" I say, "I have a spare room, come stay." Nobody on earth would take up this invitation. A strange person you've never met sends you a very odd insomniac fan letter at 4 o'clock in the morning, and then you say yes. But Krissy is a woman who says yes. And here comes the product, which is The 3 Burials of Lotty Kneen, an incredible story about Krissy's grandmother. Of course, it's not the only coincidence in this book. There are bookshop discoveries. There are nuns that come out of the woodwork. There are family members that seem to appear from the dust of the desert. It's not just my email. This book seems to be written under enchantment, which is only right for a novel, well, not a novel. A novel, we'll work out that in a minute, what in fact this is. But it's only right for a book about a woman who declared herself a witch, who raised her family on a diet of fairy tales, and who spent her life fashioning mythological creatures from paper. So who is Lotty Kneen? And more importantly, who is the granddaughter that she raised? How do you tell a story that you had kept from you? How do you fashion your own story when it's been under lock and key? Imperious, secretive, determinedly silent. This is the story of Lottie. So before this quest started, Krissy, how would you have told me the story of Lotty Kneen? Who was she to you?
So before I went searching for my grandmother's history, all I knew about her was that she was the matriarch of the family, that she was very kind of controlling, that she was incredibly tough, loving, but fiercely loving, and that she really kept us under lock and key. So she was the, if my sister and I and my mother, in fact, and my aunt as well, were like maidens in the tower. Only our hair wasn't long enough to to let it down and have somebody climb up. So she was really the keeper of the people in my family. And I didn't know anything else. She was full of secrets. I didn't have any idea of where all of that came from.
And they were closely guarded secrets. You asked, you wanted to know who you were.
Yeah, I've always wanted to know, particularly because, if a secret is kept from you, you think it gives it more power. And so the idea that we weren't allowed to know anything about our family background, except for the fact that my grandmother was born in Slovenia and that my grandfather and my mother and my aunt were born in Egypt. I didn't know anything else about the family history at all. I knew that they'd arrived sometime in the 60s into Australia, but that was all I had to go on, really.
So you have an imperious, secretive Slovenian Egyptian sort of trajectory.
Yeah.
And that's all you have.
Yeah.
And a kind of forbidding presence that says, don't look any further.
Yes. Yep.
How would you have told the story of yourself before you undertook this?
I really was rootless, I suppose. I felt like I didn't belong. I always felt like I didn't completely belong here, even though I was born in Australia, born in Blacktown in Western Sydney. It was a city full of migrants, and yet all the other migrant kids had these kind of, they'd go to Greek dancing on the weekend, or they'd have family feasts and have lots of relatives over, and all of the people on my street had lots of community and lots of people joining in, whereas we didn't. And so for me, I didn't feel like I had a community. I didn't feel like I fitted in Australia, and yet I didn't feel like I had a place to call home.
So this book, in a sense, begins at the end. It begins when you lose Lottie, and that opens up a different set of questions for you. Could we maybe have a reading of the first of the 3 burials of Lottie?
Yeah, I'll do a little bit of reading from the beginning of the book. We dig. It is just my beautiful boy and me, 40-degree heat, out in the dust and dry and spear grass, with our car full of flowering plants in pots. They will need water. They will die. Perhaps this is why my mother and my aunt refused to join us for this. They know it is futile, that the garden will return to weeds soon enough. It is a fancy, this digging. I dig, and it hurts to dig, and I'm sweating through my thin dress. I dig, and I can't get enough water to replace the sweat. I am dizzy with it. It will look so good when it is done, I say to Anthony, knowing this is a lie. It will look good for a few days, and then it will die, and no one will ever visit the spot again. It will look great, Anthony tells me. She would have been so happy to know you're doing this. She wouldn't. My grandmother hated flowers. She said they reminded her of death. She wouldn't let us bring cut flowers into her side of the house. We would have to hide them in our rooms, or better still, leave them on the plants where they belonged. All through her life, she told me she would never die. She was immortal. And anyway, by that time, technology would be so advanced that they would keep her alive inside a computer. I didn't believe her, but I did. Exhausted, smelling of sweat and dirt, I am covered in some kind of heat or plant-related rash that spreads out across my skin from my chin down to my torso. We dig the final hole. We pause in front of it. We have put a little white picket fence around our flowering plants, At least when they all die, we'll be able to find this spot again, hidden amongst the spear grass in the lantana. You should say something for Lottie, Anthony suggests. I haven't prepared a speech. I open the container the funeral home gave me, the weight of it. It's heavy, but not nearly heavy enough. I love you, Mum. I'll miss you, I say, and begin to tip the container. This, too, is not enough, but I know I will be finding the words for the rest of my life. There is time to find the right eulogy for her. There is half a lifetime ahead of me now. I tip most of the ashes into the grave we've dug, but I can't let go of everything, back into the hot, dry ground. I want to keep her with me. I'll keep some, I say to Anthony, and he doesn't protest. He knows what my grandmother means to me. He knows she is a knot of love and fear and regret and complications. He puts the final touch on the grave, a statue of a doe that my mother and my aunt gave her last Christmas. It was kitsch, just a mass-produced model. I had never thought much of those fiberglass figurines that my family liked so much, but here on the grave, it does look right. A little fawn tucked up in a garden of flowers. It won't last, but does it need to? I have this memory now. I have a place to locate her in her chosen home in front of Dragon Hall. We stand for a moment in front of the makeshift grave. It must look like we are praying, but inside I've gone blank. I don't know what I should say or do. We pack up our shovels and fertilizer and coil up the garden hose we borrowed from the main house. I walk away with a handful of her in a little jar tucked into my handbag.
What did Lottie's death loose in you? What did it make possible?
Well, while she was alive, I always felt like she could see inside my head. So anything I was thinking, she would know. And I knew that she didn't want me to do any research into my family history. And yet I was, desperate to find out more about where I'd come from. And when she died, I really did think, now I can find out. Now I can actually make a journey. I can go to Slovenia and find out anything I can about who I am. I really had this longing to find out something about myself and to find out what was such a big secret. Why was my grandmother keeping this giant secret of our history from me? There must be something. And so I decided that I could go at that point.
But you didn't have anything. You didn't have maps. You didn't have names. You didn't have dates. You didn't have documents. She had managed to sort of expunge her history. What do you do to piece together a journey when you've been handed no map?
I didn't know what I was going to do. So I started writing. I started by imagining what possibly my great-great-grandmother would have been like and what her place in the world was. So I read a little bit about Slovenia and I started writing fictional stuff. And I knew that my grandmother told fairy tales. And I knew that those fairy tales were like secret hidden messages to me. So I knew that if I could find the reason that she liked particular fairy tales, maybe that would tell me something about her. And I also, she loved to cook and she kept her food culture really close. She taught me some dishes, but she didn't teach anyone else in the family how to cook, and no one else in the family still don't know how to cook. And so that cooking culture seemed to be a clue to who she was. So I thought, I'll go to Slovenia, I'll find these dishes that she used to cook, I'll find the fairy tales, I'll see if I get off the plane and suddenly everybody looks like me. I know that there was a time when Anthony and I were at a film festival, and I think it was the Iranian Film Festival, and we arrived late. And so we went straight in and watched the film, and then we came out and everybody that came out looked exactly like me. And we kind of looked around and Anthony was like, oh my God, like, are you Iranian? Like, we just kind of walked out and went, I look like everybody else here. They all had the kind of wild curly hair. They're all short. They're all a bit dumpy. And I kind of thought, oh, gee, this is my people. And so I thought, I'm going to get off the plane in Slovenia and I'm going to see all these kind of short, people with the wild curly hair. And that actually wasn't what happened. No. There's a lot of tall blonde Slovenians.
Nothing like me at all. So when your body's not a map, you have fairy tales. Can you tell us one of the fairy tales that you were trying to trace? Can you tell us a story?
Yeah, I can. There's a fairy tale about it's pretty dark, but there's a fairy tale about a couple of children who were mimicking their parents. They killed a pig. The parents killed a pig and were cooking a pig, and they were mimicking their parents. And one of them took the carving knife and killed his brother and sliced it like you'd do a pig. And the sound of this happening, the mother was actually upstairs washing the baby, and she heard the sound of this screaming and went downstairs and realized that her older son had killed the younger son. And so in a fit of anger, she took the knife and killed the older son. And then she realized she left the baby in the bath and went upstairs, and the baby had drowned. And so she died soon after of grief. And her husband came home and found the whole family dead, and he hung himself. So, this is like, and have a good sleep, children. Good night. I'll see you tomorrow. Can I have another one, Mum?
And the grand moral of that story is?
Well, I think maybe it was about not killing animals.
Yeah, okay.
I don't know, my grandmother was a vegetarian, and I was brought up a vegetarian. And so there was this kind of thing about not killing animals and not killing, like this kind of idea of being, peaceful and not killing people. So, these kind of, her tales were really gruesome, and the protagonists always died in them. And there was a lot of girls that, died in the snow as well. There was a lot of people who froze to death. So I just thought I was going to go to Slovenia and see all these kind of gruesome tales represented and people just like me, and I'd find my place in the world.
So you go to Slovenia and you see no one like you, and you're armed with a handful of mildly disturbing fairy tales.
Yes, and some food.
And the first of the very odd coincidences start to happen in a bookshop that kind of wrench open this story in ways that you did not expect.
Yeah. So before I go to the bookshop, the food was the problem too.
Oh, was it? Okay.
Because my friend and the Coziers are in the audience tonight. Sylvia and Ian Cozier are back there, who are dear friends of mine, and their son James was a really great friend of mine, and lives over in Slovenia now. And I didn't know until after I became close friends with James that the family was Slovenian as well, and another coincidence. And so when I went over there, James was there, and I started cooking these Slovenian dishes out of Slovenian cookbooks for James and Anna, and realised that they weren't what I had grown up on. This was not the food that I'd grown up on. So another dead end with the food culture.
So you have the wrong face, the wrong food.
Yeah. The
terrifying stories.
Yeah, which weren't really replicated there, although there were a lot of dragons. And dragons were a particular thing that she loved. And there were dragons all over Slovenia, dragon bridge, dragons on the buildings. There were dragons everywhere. So that made sense.
But effectively you hit a kind of intellectual wall.
Yeah.
And then you just happen to go
to this bookshop. This was a bookshop that I chose. I always like to choose a place to write. And so I chose this cafe, which was just above a bookshop. And so the bookshop below the cafe was the place that I went to write. And I was writing there, went down to the bookshop and decided I've struck a dead end with the Slovenian stuff. So I'm going to find out a bit about the Egyptian stuff. Let's go find out about Egypt. So I went downstairs and I asked the bookseller, have you got any books about Egypt? And she said, well, do you want something about the pharaohs? I was like, no. My grandmother was Slovenian, but she went to Egypt, and that's where my mother was born. And she went, oh, she's Alexandrinka then.
Alexandrinka?
Alexandrinka was the word. I'd never heard of this thing. I'd never heard of Alexandrinka. And she went, oh, it's the women, the Slovene women who went over to Egypt. And I had never heard of this. And she said, yeah, there was a whole movement of women that went over to work in Egypt. And she pulled out a book, and it was all about the Alexandrinka. And I bought the book and I went upstairs and I found this story, which I'd never heard and which wasn't really, had never been told to me even in the month and a half I'd been in Slovenia. But this whole group of women, like 40% of the women from this one particular region, went to Egypt to work as wet nurses, as nannies, and as ladies' companions. And they were really valued because they had these incredible skills that were valued there, which was they were Catholic, and the Italian women that that employed them were Catholic, and so they liked their children being brought up by Catholic nannies, and they were they spoke lots of languages, and including Italian, and so that was another plus, and also they were supposed to be kind, and so they wanted their kids to be brought up by these kind Slovenian women, very unlike my grandmother. And so this was something that happened because the Italians had taken over quite a lot of the territory, which was Austro-Hungarian, but was Slavic people were there. And the Italians wanted it to be Italian territory, so they punished anyone who spoke in Slovene, and so that became an underground language. The kids were brought up speaking Italian rather than Slovene, and the Slovene men weren't allowed to work, and so there was no other way of earning money apart from the women leaving. And it became known that they were great nannies and also wet nurses. So a lot of women had babies, left their babies at home with relatives, and then got on the boat to go and nurse someone else's kid.
Discover that your family story, which had felt so unique and so isolating, all of a sudden realize you're part of a global movement of women, of women's workers. Yeah. What does that story open up for you in terms of clues and possibilities?
It was a massive moment for me. I've still got the notebook where I wrote, I'm a part of something. I actually have a place to fit. I'm a part of something. And this was the same day I got this book, the same day I learned about the Alexandria. I suddenly felt that I had clicked into place, that there was a space for me. I was a part of this movement of women. It had a name. It had a book written about it, and that was me. I could see myself in those pages. This was my history, not the Slovenes that stayed in Slovenia and grew up with Slovene culture, but the Slovenes that left and went to Egypt and grew up in this strange hybrid place between Slovenia and Egypt.
That's extraordinary.
It is. It was the most amazing day of my life. I felt very happy. I just felt this kind of weight lift off me. I felt like, that suddenly being displaced my entire life and feeling like I didn't have a place. I suddenly was like, I've got this. No one can take this away from me. I have a history now.
And to take a little step out of the narrative of this for a minute, we don't often tell the stories of women workers. We don't tell the stories of cooks and seamstresses and nannies and wet nurses. And yet, in the whole history of the global economy, they are its rumbling underground engine. Mm. How do you feel you have a responsibility now to tell that story or to keep it alive? Like, once you've learned that that's such an important part of your family story, how do we keep telling those stories and giving them the space they deserve?
It's it's happening. I think that what's happening is this particular movement of women, the grandchildren of them, like me, the grandchildren of the Alexandria are becoming, activists. They're actually reclaiming this history. They're writing stories. They're building. There's a sculpture built in Krissy now that is a monument to the Alexandria. Somebody else put on a cultural exhibition with little snippets of interviews with the women who were alive at the time, and that became a thing. There's people who've made a plaque in Alexandria and an exact same plaque over in Slovenia that kind of tracks the journey from Trieste to Alexandria, which is the journey that they went. It's a map. And so there are these women, and I'm a part of those women, who are keeping the story alive and who are foregrounding it. And they're finding each other. Now that I've put this book out in the world, I found a Facebook group for the Alexandria, and they're desperate for these stories. I've found other people who have contacted me and said, my grandmother was Alexandria, my great-grandmother was Alexandria, and these people are finding each other. And I've found there's a Salwa, a woman that I met when I went to visit you in Egypt, Salwa, who lives in Cairo. She started a Slovene society for those who were left in Egypt, the Slovenes that are left in Egypt. And she has got the only book of first-person tales of what it was like. So the voices of these women was only in Slovene, and there was no English translation. And so I helped her. I paid for a translator and paid for her to publish this book, which is now available for people to buy. So I feel like, this is a responsibility for us to kind of bring these stories because you walk everywhere in Slovenia and there's these war memorials to the men who died in this battle or that battle and who fought for, you know, the partisans or whatever. There's all these statues everywhere, but there's only this, you know, this one statue to the women that kept this whole community alive.
What would their lives have been like? They've left their villages, so you have an entire generation or a couple of generations of women, 40%, 50%, who leave the village to go to Alexandria to keep, in a sense, their communities alive.
Yes.
What would their lives have been like?
Well, before they left, their lives went fantastic. It was, you know, it was a community under pressure. There was incredible poverty. People were starving. There was war, particularly over this one particular part of land, which is between Italy and Slovenia. The border changed so often. In fact, when I went to my village, there's a row of bricks right in the middle of the cemetery when I went to try and find the graves. And it's got 2 dates. And basically, this was where the border was between Italy and Slovenia. They put it smack dab in the middle of the cemetery. So, and it had barbed wire, so people couldn't visit their graves on the other side. So, you know, old women who had their partners' graves were at the back of the cemetery, they couldn't go there anymore. They couldn't visit, and they were in the same community. So instead of going around the cemetery, they went straight through it. You weren't allowed to go through it. So, you know, it was quite traumatic for these people. I don't know where we started now, but it was quite traumatic for these people to have this war over this particular part of territory.
And then they're pulled out and they end up in one of the cosmopolitan cultural capitals of the world at the time.
That's right, yeah. And it was eye-opening for people. It actually made a generation of feminists because these women at home in Slovenia are still very, very much a patriarchal society. The men were in charge. I was told stories about how there was, you know, every family had only one knife, and that was the knife to carve the meat, and the knife was held by the man who was the man of the house, had the knife, and when he went to war, it got passed down to the oldest son. You know, when he went to war, it would be passed down to the son below. So the women weren't allowed to have the knife to carve the meat that they'd just cooked. You know, it's crazy. And so when the women actually came back, some of the women came back from Slovenia eventually, some of them sooner than later, others, you know, stayed 50 years in Egypt. And one of the things they brought back was knives and forks, so that everybody had a knife, which is kind of egalitarian of them. But and also hand washing became a thing because they learned about the importance of hand washing over in Egypt, and brought that back. I think because everyone's packed together in Egypt, and you know, as you know, pandemic can spread pretty quickly in a place like that. And so they actually taught their communities this kind of cleanliness with hand washing, and they had learnt all these stories about the rest of the world. Some of them had travelled the world with their families that they were working for.
They were wealthy families.
They were wealthy families. They were dressed in silks, whereas at home it was like really heavy, you know, linen and homespun wool, and it was not, you know, very comfortable clothing. Whereas when they went to Egypt, they were in these amazing frocks that you see in the movies. You know, they were movie stars.
And wedding dresses from Paris.
Wedding dresses from Paris, like my grandmother's. Yeah, all this was really important to them. But of course, it was a different culture. And when some of them went back, and my grandmother didn't go back to Slovenia, but when some of them went back to Slovenia, they'd have to put all those dresses in a suitcase and put it up in the attic because they couldn't be swanning around in these indecent clothing which showed their shoulders and were not, you know, they were very indecent for Slovenian culture at the time.
So there's this extraordinary story that opens up, that places your story inside this massive global movement. But what it allows you to do is actually pinpoint with quite an amazing amount of geographical accuracy where your family are from, which opens up the next part of your story. So you're able to find your village in Slovenia because these women came from just a small part of the country.
Yeah, that's right. So being able to find that village and pinpoint that village, and also now the women who are contacting me, who are the grandchildren of these Alexandrians, are always saying, I'm from the village next to yours. You know, I'm from the village 2 villages up. So, you know, they're all from this little tiny area, and they all sort of knew each other. They all knew each other when they went to Egypt because they got placed with the nuns before they got placed with families. So they went to the nuns' convent, and I went there to see the nuns' convent, and then they would be placed with families. And they all gathered back at the convent on Sundays, which was their day off, to be able to kind of talk about what they were doing and gossip and that sort of thing. So it was quite an amazing experience to actually be there, and I totally would not have gone if it wasn't for this email that I received just after I bought that book, by the way. So I bought this book. I'm in this kind of, euphoria, I suppose, of knowing who I am for the first time, feeling the happiest I've ever been. And then pretty much, I think it was on the same afternoon, I got this email from Beejay out of the blue saying, come to Egypt. And here I am reading about Egypt in my book. And it was just like this weird thing. And Anthony was back at our Airbnb. And I basically texted Anthony and went, I think we have to go to Egypt now. I think we've got to go. And the even weirder coincidence.
Oh, it gets weird. It does
get weirder. The weirder coincidence was I did think that maybe this was going to end up like Misery by Stephen King.
That I was a crazy person, which is not an unreasonable.
I didn't even know if she was a boy or a girl. Her name was Beejay. I have no idea.
I don't have a social media profile. I'm not on anything. There's one photo of me. There has been a persistent rumor for years that I'm actually a pseudonym. I'm another Australian author who's created a persona so that I can shit on other Australian authors with impunity. I am real. You have all seen me. But I'm hard to pin. So, Krissy.
I then emailed my agent. Because my agent actually emailed me saying, how is the research going? And she did that quite regularly. Jane Novak, who can't be here tonight but sends her regards. And she said, how's the research going? And I went, well, very strange. I've just been invited to Egypt by this odd Australian person called Bj Silcox. And she went, oh my goodness, I'm her agent. And I was like, that's odd. And I was like, is she okay or is she a bit weird? And she was like, no, she's amazing. You'd love her. You must go.
And so Krissy turns up and she says, is there anything I can bring for you? And it's Egypt and it's very difficult to find pork products. So I said, can you please bring a salami? So Krissy arrives with this giant Slovenian salami.
From my village.
From her village, which was magnificent.
Because my relatives, when I went to the village, I actually found relatives at the village, which was crazy. So I asked the lady, and James was instrumental in this, because I went to the village, asked around, no one could speak English. I was doing this strange, like me, my grandmother, my mother, mama, that sort of thing, just talking about that and then going, Alexandria, they'd all go, oh, Alexandria. They all knew Alexandria. But then I couldn't communicate anything. So I ended up going back with James and spending this incredible day of him translating, finding out that there was family in the village, and suddenly these people are turning up and James is translating and going, this is a cousin, I think, and this person was related to you. And these conversations were going on. It was head spinny. And the sausage that I brought for Beejay came from a cousin who made his own sausages, his own salamis, and
it's delicious.
It's
really delicious. It held up in the heat. Yeah.
I put it in my suitcase, and it took up the whole suitcase. Turned up in Egypt with a giant salami from my hometown coming to.
So I want to talk about food. You're in Egypt with us, and we go to Alexandria together into this tiny little back street, into a tiny little restaurant, and we're served a meal called ful madams, which is made in Egypt. You'll get ful everywhere. It's a stewed fava bean breakfast dish usually, but in Alexandria they make a beautiful version of it, which you have for dinner. And we sit down and we are served this, and then you appear to go into a strange, rapturous place that no one can follow. What happened at that dinner? What happened to you?
It was the food that I was searching for the whole time. Sundays with my grandmother, she'd put the beans had to be soaked for 2 days beforehand, so the beans would be soaked, and then on the Sunday morning she'd start cooking. You have to cook it really, really slowly. It's the most slow cooked meal ever. And she'd slow cook this meal, and slowly the room would fill up with this fug of this smell, which I've never smelt before, and which I smelt there in that restaurant.
Oh, and I've smelt a lot. Yep.
It was I loved it because it would make you feel hungry, and it was these really, she'd do onions that were really, really browned browned onions and this slow cooked fava bean, and it would end up being this creamy dish. It was just so creamy. And then she'd chop up garlic and tomato and vinegar and lemon on top. And that's exactly how they did it in Alexandria.
Every region has a different way of serving their food, but Alexandria has a very particular way, which I haven't had either, but it is the best way.
It is. Yeah. It was amazing. So this food was like the food of childhood. Suddenly I was there in my grandmother's kitchen waiting for the fava beans to be done for the fool.
But we were in Alexandria for another ridiculous coincidence, which is that we put on, my husband works for the Australian Embassy. We organised for Krissy to give a talk about what she was doing because it was extraordinary. And we said, Egypt is the kind of place, Cairo is the kind of city, if you put yourself out there, something will come back to you. And then all of a sudden, that's exactly what happens. You talk, and then we end up being connected to the Slovenian ambassador, to Slovenes with family who've done exactly the same thing. And we find ourselves in Alexandria, and what happens next?
So we went to Alexandria, particularly to meet the nuns, who were the nuns that originally took the women and housed them. And it would have been the place that my grandmother was first put in when she went to Egypt. But also to meet this woman called Magda, who was one of the last remaining grandchildren and children of the Alexandrinka there. And so I finally got to Magda's place, and her place looked like it was a really old apartment building, like the traditional old apartment buildings in Egypt. It hadn't been changed ever. It was gorgeous, and it felt like I was stepping back into a black and white movie. I could kind of imagine people swanning around in these silk dresses in this house. And we were sitting there, and she served us these Egyptian sweets, which we were eating. And then she said, where are your family from? And I said, they're from Mirren. And she went, my great-grandmother, my grandmother was from Mirren as well. I was like, wow, that's really interesting. We're from the same town. And I said, what was her name before marriage? And she said Mazetic. And Mazetic was my great-grandmother's maiden name. And suddenly I went, we're related. And her daughter was there visiting from America, and she was like, what is happening? Like, we're related, but not really related. And I was like, no, we have to be related. We've got the same last name from the same tiny village, which only has a few hundred people in it. We must be related. And we tried to figure out where we all fitted in, and we couldn't quite figure it out. But only last week, I did a genetic test, and they came back with a Slovenian match. And I talked to them, and they were third cousins of mine, and they're related to Magda. So there's the kind of missing link came back last week, that I know through the genetic test that I'm related to Magda.
So in a country of 100 million people.
Yes.
And you've been in it for 3 days.
Yes.
And we managed to find your only relative.
Yeah, my third cousin.
Your third cousin, hiding in a top floor apartment block in the suburbs of Alexandria.
Yes, a suburb called Cleopatra. Lovely. It's beautiful.
This is the kind of enchantment that sits over the writing of this book. And I want to talk about craft for a minute, because it is in fact more than a story. It is a work of beautiful literature.
Thank you.
But it's part elegy, part travelogue, part fairy tales, part how to make an Archaeopteryx, how to cook full madames, part photographs, part travelogue, part memoir, part poems. What in God's name have you made? And how did you make it?
It was basically paper mache. I think this whole book is paper mache. I basically did exactly what we do when we make the paper mache models when I was younger, which is to kind of get big wads of paper, tear it all up, and then stick it all together. So along the way, whenever I thought of something that might feed into this book, I just wrote it down. So there's a chapter, How to Make an Archaeopteryx, which is actually about how my family make their paper mache models. So it basically is about that, the techniques, which were all secrets. They didn't want anyone to know the secrets, so I put that on the page. Thanks to my grandmother setting the hailstorm. So, that was part of the hailstorm. But, there's the recipes, because they were really important to that journey. And there's also the you know, the people that I found, and also all those fictional stories that I imagined were really a part of my journey as well, because I thought for a while that all I would be able to get was a bit of memoir and a bit of fiction and put them together to make some sort of imagined history.
So what was the book? That's an interesting thing. What was the book going to be? In your head, what did you think you were going to build?
I thought that it would be sort of a part fairy tale, part memoir. I didn't know that the history would be so important to the book. So I thought I'm going to have to kind of make it as a fictionalized version of what I imagined my history was, with the memoir of going there and being disappointed and not finding anything and coming back without a story.
And
what I thought we'd have.
Microbiome and science too.
Yeah. I was really interested. I'm fascinated by science, and so I read a lot of science magazines. And I was reading about how your microbiome is inherited as well. So this beautiful 3-year-old Charlie, who's being very quiet in the audience somewhere, has the microbiome that's passed down from Charlie's mother. The first gulp that you take, you swallow, all the viscera of your mother, and that viscera if you are very careful at this, you can track that back generations. So it's your grandmother's viscera, it's your great grandmother's viscera. This kind of first gulp of water and blood is inherited through several generations. And the people that first touch you, their microbes go on your skin and they colonize your skin, and they become, if they're strong, they become the primary the primary group that's colonized that. And that can be your parents, and they've got that from their parents. So there's this inheritance that goes down on this micro level in people. And I really thought that was going to be a major part of the book. And it is a part of the book, but it didn't become as important as that hidden history that I found.
So you were not expecting to find anything?
No. Once I'd gotten there, I was like, no, this is going to come to nothing, And so I thought that it was going to be a story of disappointment. It wasn't going to end as positively as it does.
So now that you have been through this beautiful, strange, enchanted journey, how would you tell the story of your grandmother to us now?
I know a lot more about her childhood, and I know that the reason that she held us so close and didn't want us to leave her was because she was left. Like, she wasn't the first generation to go to Egypt. Her mother went to Egypt. Her mother needed to go to raise money for the family. So she was left behind in Slovenia as a very small child, parented by relatives. And then after years of her mother being away and not knowing who her mother was, she was called for because her mother's family that she was working for were very, very rich and liked her, and so called for the children one at a time. So eventually my grandmother was called to go to Slovenia, and she did that journey by herself on the train, going from the village to Trieste and then getting on a boat by herself, we think probably at around 9 years old, and then doing that giant journey to a very foreign country by herself, which would have marked her. And being left by her mother in the first place would have marked her. And then arriving and getting to know, she wouldn't be able to live with that mother. She had to live with the nuns because the mother had a family, and so she had to live with the nuns and just see her mother on weekends. And that whole kind of loss of family and being alone meant that my grandmother kept us incredibly tightly close to her and did not want us to leave. And there's other mysteries in this story that I've unpicked that we haven't even got to, that explain other certain things about my grandmother and her fears and her cruelties. But, this is a story of a very damaged child who grew up without parenting, without proper parents, and who then had to leave Egypt overnight and go to a new place. She had to go to England one night when there was a mark on her family's door, and they thought they were going to be burnt out. And so she had to leave. This was during the 50s,
when Nasser came to power.
When Nasser came to power.
There was a kind of grand nationalist movement in Egypt that removed a lot of the foreign workers. Yeah.
And she basically left overnight with nothing. So yet again, leaving Slovenia with nothing, leaving Egypt with nothing but these two children, and then arriving in England, a place that she said that she felt there was a lot of racism towards her in England, and so then jumping on the bandwagon of the white Australian policy, she became one of those people who had an English passport who could come to Australia for very cheap, and brought her family here, knowing that she wasn't really white at the time. I mean, Eastern Europeans are now considered white, but they weren't at the time. And so knowing that she was here under those kind of false pretenses in the white Australian policy, and then setting up a new life, it makes so much sense of why she was so harsh and cruel and scared, and why she loved us so much. She wouldn't let us have a life of our own.
And a final question from me. You've been able to reconcile these versions of who your grandmother is, the person she was before, and now how you think about her with great compassion. If I was to say, once upon a time, there was a little girl called Krissy, what's the story you have to tell about yourself now?
I would say that she was the next generation of a long history of strong women who had to support their communities and who had to earn to keep their families alive, and that I still support my community, and that that's a part of me now.
And she's an extraordinary writer, an extraordinary friend, and I think writing my fan letter at 4 o'clock in the morning is one of the most life-changing, extraordinary things I've ever done.
For both of us.
For both of us.
And now, thanks to that, we have this book in the world. Can I say a few thank yous before
Of course you can, but can we give you a round of applause, please? Write fan letters to your favourite people.
Yeah, do it. Say that you love them. And saying that I love them, Bj, amazing. And I'm so glad she came all the way from Canberra to do this. I would like to say she came all the way from Egypt to do this, but she actually had left Egypt because of COVID and is in Canberra now. So Bj Silcox. And there's a massive list of people that I've thanked at the back of the book. So I do hope that you get to dig in and see that that it does take a village to make a book. But the village that the village church in this area is avid reader. Our high priest, Fiona Stager. And now, you know, I don't know if you've heard the news, but we've been nominated as one of the 3 shortlisted for the 3 best bookshops in the world. And the other 2 bookshops are insane. They have like all these kind of like, you know, staircases that wind up to chandeliers. And as Trent did say, we did get new carpet a couple of years ago. So it's pretty good. So I have landed in the best places. I've landed in the Church of Avid Reader, which has supported my career forever, for 20 years, because I've been writing for, 10 years before that. I've only just taken my long service leave. And I also landed in the other best place in the world, which was in the hands of Mandy, one of the best editors in Australia, and working for the best publishing house in the country, Text Publishing. So thank you to Mandy as well. And I'd like to thank my agent who can't be here, but who really, really wanted to be here. And Jane has followed me to Sydney, though, to support my events there. But also my partner who decided, Anthony, who just went, sure, we'll go to Slovenia for 3 months. Sure, I'll go with you to Egypt. And who constantly supports all of my crazy choices. I would never be able to do this without a supportive partner like Anthony, so thank you very much. And thank you to James particularly, James and Anna, who really did. They were, without James and Anna on the ground in Slovenia, we would not be able to have done any of this because we just couldn't speak any languages over there. English is just useless in that part of the world. And James and Anna were amazing. And also a very final thank you to the writing community in Brisbane particularly, because, oh my God, this community in Brisbane of writers is, I don't think it's replicated anywhere in the world. half of them are here tonight. The other half are on Zoom. They're amazing. They're supportive. And we really have the best writers in the world here in this tiny little city. It's amazing. So thanks to all of you as well. Thank you.
That was so wonderful. Thank you both. And I think for me, it was about readers who change people's lives, booksellers who change people's lives, and also food. So there's just one little step. So you need to hold the microphone.
She's made some former damas.
It's petitza. I think this is what Sylvia would say. It's petitza. So I've never made it before.
Can I say, this is a national dish in Slovenia. It's been, you know how we protect our great buildings here and we put protection orders on them and they're heritage listed? This is a heritage listed cake. In Slovenia, they heritage list their cakes, and this one particularly, I think it might be 2 heritage listed cakes. And it is, you're not allowed to cook it anyway except this recipe. And Fiona's done it. It takes like 1 million days. It takes a week.
I hope I've done it. But anyway, so first time thanks to Sylvia because I need to borrow her oven as well. But anyway, I think we need to sing happy birthday, happy book day to Krissy Kneen. So 1, 2, 3. Happy book day to you. Happy book day to you. Happy book day, dear Krissy. Happy book day to you.
I'm going to cut a slice because I know what patissa looks like.
It should be striated. This is my aim, is to have a striated cake.
Oh, look.
Has it I've done it. I should have been a Slovenian nun. That's all I can say.
I want to taste it. My grandmother made this when I was younger. Oh, yeah.
Is it okay?
This is exactly.
Great. Thank you all so much for joining us. Krissy's books are for sale at the counter. We're going to quickly turn this kind of audience back into a functioning bookshop, and we'll have Krissy signing at the front of the shop. Thank you all so much for coming. Oh, and thank you, Zoom. Please thank Zoom, everybody. Thank you, Zoom. Thank you. Oh my God, you made it.